Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome to the deep dive.
Hello.
We've got a really fascinating stack of material for you today. We're pulling from excerpts of a true classic, Aristotle's Ethics.
Mm-hmm. A foundational text.
Absolutely. You've given us this incredible source, and our mission really is to guide you through it, extracting the most important nuggets of knowledge.
Right. About what Aristotle called the philosophy of human affairs.
Exactly.
And this isn't just, dusty old history. It's ancient wisdom, yes, but it's fundamentally about you and me right now.
Right. It's a deep dive into those core questions. What actually makes a good life?
Yeah. And how do we build good character? How do we even do that?
And crucially, how does the community society around us fit into our own happiness?
That's a big one for him.
It really is. Aristotle wasn't just writing theory here. He saw his ethics and his politics as like two halves of the same coin.
Two parts of a single treatise, yeah, on human conduct.
On how humans act and hopefully live well together. He's asking this huge question in the ethics. What is the ultimate goal for a human being? What's that supreme good we're all aiming for?
How do we get there?
Yeah, how do we actually achieve it?
And his answer is, well, maybe a bit surprising for us today.
And how so?
Well, he doesn't say the ultimate end is, say, beauty, or following some divine command, or even just like feeling good moment to moment.
Okay.
He identifies it as the object of desire. That thing which, if you really achieved it, would genuinely fulfill your deepest human longing. It's the ultimate satisfaction.
And he calls this happiness. But he's very specific, isn't he?
Extremely. He clarifies he means welfare or well-being. Eudaimonia is the Greek term.
Right, so think of it less like a fleeting mood, like feeling cheerful today.
Exactly. More like a state of flourishing, a kind of peak human performance over a complete lifetime.
The ultimate purpose behind, well, everything we do.
Right. He famously defines this human good, this happiness, as a working of the soul in the way of excellence or virtue.
And he refines that to in the way of the best and most perfect excellence.
But here's the catch, and it's a big one. He immediately adds that this flourishing needs to happen in a complete life.
Meaning over time, not just a flash in the pan.
And importantly, it requires external goods, things he sometimes calls appliances or instruments.
Okay, so it's not just about having an excellent character inside.
No. It's also about having the right circumstances, adequate resources, health, maybe good fortune, and living long enough for that excellence to actually play out.
He uses that example of Priam, the king of Troy.
Yeah, the tragic figure, someone who suffered terrible misfortunes in old age, no matter how virtuous they might have been earlier. Well, Aristotle says you couldn't really call them happy in the full sense.
So happiness for him has a certain stability. It's found in consistently acting and thinking virtuously over time with some basic level of external support.
That seems right, which of course raises the crucial question. How do we actually get this excellence, this virtue that's so central to happiness?
Yeah, how do we acquire it?
Aristotle is really clear on this. It's not just theoretical knowledge.
You can't just read a book about it.
No. Just knowing what goodness is by itself won't make us good people. Talking about it isn't enough.
Right. You can't just read about courage and then suddenly be brave when, things get tough.
Exactly. He argues that for this kind of transformation of character, you actually need a powerful external force. The great force of the political community or state and its primary tool, law.
Law. Wow. Okay.
Yes, because the goal of the state for Aristotle is the production of good character in its citizens.
Why? Because that's the key to their happiness.
Pretty much. Because good character is the indispensable condition and chief determinant of happiness for the whole community.
Okay. And he breaks down these excellences, these virtues, into two main types, right?
He does. Intellectual and moral.
Intellectual virtues. That sounds like school stuff.
Kind of, yeah. Things like scientific knowledge, intelligence, practical wisdom, these are generally learned through study and instruction.
Okay. And the other type?
Moral virtues. Things like being generous, having self-control, being just, courageous.
The character traits.
Exactly. And these are acquired differently. They come through discipline and habit. These are what make up your character, and they are what primarily determine happiness for most people.
So this is really the core focus of his ethics, these moral virtues.
Very much so.
Now, diving deeper into moral virtue, he makes a really crucial point about how we actually internalize these rules of conduct, how we make them ours.
Right. He says a moral virtue is a kind of obedience to a maxim or rule, but But that obedience requires you to actually accept the rule, to make it your own, not just understand it intellectually.
It's about the doing.
Yes, it's about doing the right thing repeatedly, habituation.
And he insists this process can't just be left up to nature or someone just telling you what's right.
No, it requires assimilation, largely by imitation and under direction and control.
Like learning a craft or an instrument.
That's a great analogy. You watch, you copy, you practice, usually under some guidance, and the result is, hopefully, a growing understanding. You start choosing the right actions because they are right.
And you develop a fixity and steadiness of purpose. You become consistent.
Exactly.
What's fascinating here is how he connects this practice to pleasure. That seems unexpected.
It does, doesn't it? But he argues that right actions and feelings actually become easier and more pleasant through habit.
Really?
Yeah. You build character by repeatedly doing virtuous actions. Doing just things makes you just. Practicing self-control helps you acquire the habit of self-control. It starts to feel natural, even good.
Okay, but he anticipates a problem here, right? Sort of confusion.
He does.
All right.
A point where you might get tripped up. You might think, well, hang on, if I'm doing a just action, doesn't that mean I'm already just?
Yeah, that sounds logical.
But he makes this critical distinction between virtue and, say, art or craft. In art, like building a house, the excellence is really in the final product, the house itself.
Yeah.
You could maybe build a good house purely by chance or just following instructions without understanding.
Right.
But for virtue, the excellence is in the person doing the action. You are only truly just when you do just actions, virtue-wise.
What does virtue-wise mean?
It means you do them intentionally from your own knowledge,
Okay.
choosing them because they are just, for their own sake.
Right.
And doing so from a firm, consistent, and pretty much unchangeable character.
Yeah.
It's about your internal state, your motivation, your settled disposition, not just the external act.
That's a much higher bar.
It absolutely is.
And that leads beautifully, I think, into his most famous idea about moral virtue, the mean state.
Ah, yes, the doctrine of the mean, central stuff.
He argues that every moral virtue is a kind of middle ground, right? A mean state between two extremes, two faulty vices.
Exactly. One of excess and one of defect when it comes to feelings and actions.
But this mean isn't like finding the exact mathematical average.
No, not at all. He stresses it's relative to us, to the individual. It's like a doctor deciding the right amount of food or exercise for a particular patient, not just prescribing the average for everyone.
So what's moderate for me might be too much or too little for you.
Precisely. It depends on the person and the situation.
He gives such clear examples. Courage, for instance.
Right. Courage is the mean between reckless rashness that's too much fearlessness, maybe, and crippling cowardice, which is too much fear or too little confidence.
And generosity with money.
That's the mean between wasteful prodigality, just throwing money away, and tight-fisted stinginess or meanness.
Even things like humor or social pleasantness.
Yeah. He talks about finding the right balance in relaxation or amusement. The mean state there is easy pleasantry or wit. The excess is being a ridiculous buffoon, always joking inappropriately, and the defect is being a boorish killjoy, unable to take or make a joke.
Finding that sweet spot.
And he highlights how incredibly difficult this is in practice. Finding this relative mean isn't easy. It takes judgment, self-awareness, and, well, skill.
Does he give any practical advice on how to aim for it?
He does offer some rules of thumb. One is to guard especially against pleasure, because our natural bias towards it makes us terrible judges of what's appropriate.
Okay, that makes sense. Anything else?
He even suggests sometimes deliberately pushing yourself towards the opposite extreme of where you naturally tend to lean.
Like overcorrecting.
Kind of. Like trying to straighten a bent piece of wood by bending it back the other way, hoping to land closer to the middle. It's a struggle.
This focus on action naturally brings us to how Aristotle thinks about action itself, specifically voluntary versus involuntary acts.
Right, a necessary distinction for talking about responsibility. A voluntary action basically originates with the person doing it, the agent, and they are aware of the specific circumstances of the action.
Pretty straightforward.
Mostly, but he points out something maybe we overlook. Actions done from strong emotions, like anger or lust, can still be voluntary.
Oh. Even if you feel compelled by the emotion.
He thinks so. It would be strange, he argues, to say that actions we naturally desire, like seeking health or learning, are involuntary just because desire is involved. If the impulse comes from within you and you know what you're doing, generally it's voluntary.
Okay. Building on that, he introduces a more refined concept, moral choice.
Yes, prohairesis. It's definitely voluntary, but it's more specific than just any voluntary act.
How so?
Well, children and animals act voluntarily out of impulse or appetite, but they don't make moral choices in Aristotle's sense. And actions done, say, on the spur of the moment out of sudden anger, even if voluntary, aren't typically considered moral choices either.
So what is moral choice?
He defines it as a deliberate desire for things in our own power.
Deliberate desire. Okay.
It involves reason and thought. It's not just wishing for an outcome. You can wish for impossible things. That's wish. And it's not just having an opinion. Opinions can be about anything, true or false, controllable or uncontrollable. Moral choice is about actively deciding on the means to achieve an end, specifically means that are within your power to enact. It comes after deliberation, after thinking through the options.
And this is really key to his argument about responsibility, isn't it?
Absolutely, because virtue and vice, he argues, are considered to be in our power.
If we can do good, we can also do bad. Or choose not to do good.
Essentially, yes. If we have the capacity to act, we generally also have the capacity not to act. He argues that we actively participate in shaping our own character, our own moral states, through the choices we make. Even if someone consistently chooses badly, becoming unjust or self-indulgent, their actions along the way were voluntary. They were choosing them.
We are, in a sense, responsible for the character we develop.
That's the thrust of it. Now, let's turn to a specific intellectual virtue that is absolutely essential for living that life of moral excellence we've been talking about.
Okay, which one?
Practical wisdom. Phronesis.
Ah, yes. Phronesis. It's different from theoretical knowledge, right? Like science or math.
Totally different. Theoretical wisdom deals with things that must be a certain way, eternal truths. Practical wisdom deals with things that can be otherwise specifically the messy, contingent world of human action.
The world of doing things well, not just making things.
Precisely. It's defined as a state conjoined with reason, true, having human good for its object, and apt to do.
Break that down a bit.
Sure. Practical wisdom is the capacity to deliberate well about what is good for you, not just in one specific area, but for living well overall, for achieving that flourishing human life. And crucially, it includes the ability to act on that deliberation.
So it's knowing and doing.
Yes, and here's a really powerful point he makes. Being vicious, having bad character, doesn't just make you do bad things.
Okay.
It actually tends to corrupt your moral principle. It blinds the soul's eye. It prevents you from even seeing correctly what the true good end is that you should be aiming for in the first place.
Wow. So you're saying that being a bad person doesn't just mean you choose badly, it actually damages your ability to properly judge what is good and right. Vice isn't just behavioral, it's cognitive. It affects your perception.
Precisely. It corrupts your moral vision. Your desires pull your reason off course.
That's quite a claim.
It is. And it leads to one of the most critical links in his entire ethical system.
Which is?
You cannot be truly good, meaning possess genuine moral virtue without practical wisdom. And conversely, you cannot be truly practically wise without moral virtue.
They're inseparable, like two sides of the same coin.
Exactly. They develop together. Practical wisdom is the guide. It helps you figure out the best way, the right means, to act in a specific situation to achieve the good end that your virtuous character desires.
So your good character sets the target wanting what's truly good.
Right. Your character determines the end you aim for.
And practical wisdom figures out the map and compass to get there, the right means in this particular situation.
That's a good way to put it. He even suggests we should pay attention to the practical advice and opinions of people who are experienced and wise in life, the elderly perhaps, even if they can't always give a neat, logical proof for why they know something.
Because experience itself has given them that power of moral vision.
Something like that. Experience shapes practical wisdom.
That's a really deep insight.
Yeah.
That wisdom in action is tied up with your moral development and shaped by lived experience, not just abstract reasoning.
Very much so. Now, shifting gears slightly, but still related to a flourishing life, he also spends quite a bit of time on friendship.
Yes. Philia. A key part of a good life for Aristotle.
Definitely. He identifies three main reasons we might like someone or find them lovable.
Which are?
Because they are good, virtuous, because they are pleasant, or because they are useful to us.
And this gives us three kinds of friendship based on those reasons.
Exactly.
So friendship for utility. That sounds like maybe a business relationship. Or networking.
Pretty much. or neighbors helping each other out, and friendship for pleasure. Maybe people you share a hobby with, or just enjoy hanging out with because they're funny.
Right. Fun friends.
Friendships based primarily on utility or pleasure are, he says, based on what you get from the other person. They're sort of accidental to the person themselves. You like them because they're useful or because they're pleasant.
And they tend not to last.
They tend to be temporary, yeah. Lasting only as long as the utility or the pleasure is there. And these kinds of friendships can exist between bad people or between good and bad people.
Okay, so what's the ideal then? The perfect friendship he talks about.
Perfect friendship is based on the goodness, the virtue of the friends themselves. You love your friend and wish good things for them for their sake because of who they are intrinsically.
Because you admire their character.
Yes, because
Okay.
of their virtue. This is the most permanent and stable kind of friendship. And it's most likely really only possible between good people who are alike in virtue.
And in these friendships, utility and pleasure might still be there.
Oh, absolutely. Good people are often useful and pleasant to each other, but those things are consequences of the friendship based on goodness, not its primary cause or reason for being.
That makes sense. And he asks a question that, feels quite modern. Does a truly happy person, someone who seems self-sufficient, actually need friends?
Yeah, it's a good question. If you've got virtue and reasonable external goods, do you still need others?
And his answer is,
A definitive yes. Man is, by nature, a social being, a political animal meant for community.
we need connection.
We do. And the company of friends, especially good friends who share and engage in virtuous activity with you, is far more desirable than being with strangers or just being alone. Living itself is good and pleasant, especially for the good person whose awareness of their own good activity is pleasant. And sharing that life, that activity, with friends is inherently pleasant because you are experiencing the good of shared life in actual operation.
There's a joy in shared virtuous activity.
Absolutely. Though he does add a practical note. You can't really have too many of these perfect friends. Genuine intimacy and shared life take time and effort, so it's naturally limited to a few.
Quality over quantity.
It seems so.
Okay. He also tackles the really tricky subject of pleasure itself.
Yes. Very controversial then, still is now. Some thinkers back then thought pleasure was the ultimate good, the goal of life. Others thought it was inherently bad or problematic.
And Aristotle, characteristically perhaps, takes a more nuanced middle path.
You could say that. He argues quite strongly that pleasure is not the chief good itself. It's not the same as happiness or flourishing activity.
Okay, so what is it then?
He sees it as something that completes or perfects an activity. It's like an added bonus that comes when things are going well.
An analogy he uses.
Is the bloom on young people. It enhances their prime, their beauty, but it isn't the prime or beauty itself. Pleasure arises when a faculty, whether it's perception like sight or hearing or intellect, is working well on its proper object, especially when both the faculty and the object are in excellent condition.
So the better the activity, the better the pleasure.
Kind of. And importantly, the pleasures that arise from virtuous activity are good and choice-worthy for the good person. They accompany and perfect the good life.
What about bodily pleasures? Food, drink, sex.
Necessary bodily pleasures are good, he thinks, but only in moderation. Primarily because they might relieve pain or are necessary for survival, not because they are inherently the highest goods or pleasures. Those come from higher activities.
So pleasure isn't the goal, but good pleasure accompanies the good life.
That's a fair summary.
Okay, so back to the ultimate end, happiness and the best kind of life. He comes back to comparing different ways of living, doesn't he?
He does, near the end of the Ethics. He considers which kind of working of the soul in accordance with virtue leads to the highest form of human flourishing.
And his conclusion.
He suggests, somewhat controversially maybe, that the highest form of happiness, the most continuous, self-sufficient, and satisfying life available to humans, is the contemplative one.
The life dedicated to philosophic contemplation, to the pure exercise of the intellect.
Yes, he sees the intellect, or nous, as the highest and most divine thing within us. And living according to this highest capacity, engaging in theoretical contemplation, is living in a way that is, in a sense, divine compared to the ordinary human life focused solely on practical matters.
He says that principle of intellect is most truly man, and therefore living in accordance with it, exercising it fully, is the path to the highest possible happiness for a human being.
He does argue that. It's the activity he thinks is most akin to the activity of the gods.
But he's a realist too, right? He doesn't just leave it there.
No, he's definitely a pragmatist. He immediately balances this by saying that the second highest degree of happiness comes from the practical life the life lived in accordance with moral virtue.
So engaging in actions of justice, courage, generosity, self-control, and the other virtues in our dealings with others, that's still a form of happiness.
Absolutely. That's the life proper to human beings living in community. This practical life of moral virtue is essential, admirable, and it is the secondary form of happiness. It's more accessible to most people and absolutely necessary for a functioning society.
And to cultivate that practical life, that moral virtue, he circles right back to where we started, doesn't he?
He does, back to habituation and the role of the community. While nature gives us the potential for virtue, achieving it, developing good character for most people, requires habit instilled from a young age. And, crucially, good laws are necessary to cultivate good character in most people. He puts a heavy burden on the lawgivers, the legislators, to make citizens good through proper habituation.
Why laws specifically?
Because, he states with a fair bit of realism, the majority of people, especially when young perhaps, are more amenable to compulsion rather than reason, and to punishment rather than to a sense of honor.
Ouch. So laws, backed by the threat of punishment, are needed to keep those whose nature is perhaps less promising in line.
That seems to be his view. Much like animals are controlled by pain or reward, many people need that external structure provided by law to guide their behavior towards virtue, at least initially.
Whereas the truly good person, or someone motivated by a sense of honor, will follow reason voluntarily.
Yes, they'll do the right thing because it's right. But for the rest, laws provide the necessary external force to compel right action, and through that action, hopefully foster right habits.
He really argues that to become good, you don't just need good teaching. You must have been brought up and habituated well right from the start.
Yes, and then you need to continue to live under good institutions, good laws throughout your life to maintain that character. Knowing what is just, as he noted earlier, isn't simple or easy. Being able to do it consistently with the right disposition. That takes skill, like mastering any art or craft.
And he even suggests that someone who genuinely wants to make people better, maybe a statesman or educator, should study politics and try to become a legislator.
Right, because legislation, the creation of good laws and institutions, was historically considered a key part of political science. Its aim was precisely this: to make citizens good and happy.
He uses the analogy of physicians, doesn't he?
He does. Just as physicians study compiled medical cases and treatments to figure out how best to restore health to individual patients.
Legislators should study different laws, constitutions, political system.
Exactly. To figure out the best systems to cultivate virtue and promote well-being in the citizens of their particular society. It's a practical science aimed squarely at human flourishing.
The challenge, as always, is taking those general principles and skillfully applying them to the particular, often messy reality of human life and society.
That's always the hard part, isn't it? Moving from the universal to the particular.
So what does this all mean? Where does this leave us? We've taken quite a deep dive into these excerpts from Aristotle's Ethics.
We have.
Exploring his foundational idea that human conduct isn't just something to think about theoretically, but it's a practical matter aimed at living well. A subject he actually places under political science.
Yeah, the science of the community. And we've seen how he identifies happiness but understands it as welfare or well-being, a kind of flourishing activity of the soul as the ultimate goal of all human action. It's not some grim duty, but the very object of our deepest desire.
Right. And key takeaways. Well, that critical distinction between intellectual virtues learned through study and moral virtues like courage or justice,
which are acquired through repeated discipline and habit, the actual formation of our character.
We unpack his famous idea of moral virtues being mean states, those balances between excess and defect.
And the crucial insight that you build character by doing virtuous actions repeatedly, intentionally, and from a stable disposition doing them virtue-wise.
We touched on voluntary action and the more specific idea of moral choice as this deliberate decision-making about the means within our power.
And the absolutely essential role of practical wisdom, phronesis, that intellectual virtue guiding our actions towards human good, and how it's totally intertwined with moral virtue itself.
Yeah, that idea that vice can actually corrupt our ability to even see the good clearly. That was striking.
It really is. We also looked briefly at his view on friendship, elevating that bond based on mutual goodness.
The perfect friendship.
Right. And his nuanced take on pleasure, not the chief good, but something that accompanies and perfects good activity.
And finally, Aristotle suggests that while the life of philosophic contemplation might be the highest and most satisfying theoretically,
The practical life of moral virtue lived in community is essential, admirable, and the second happiest life for humans.
and he drives home that point again and again. While we have a natural capacity for virtue, actually achieving good character, for most of us anyway, requires those external forces.
Good habits instilled early and sustained by good laws within a well-ordered community.
Okay, here is a final thought then for you to consider. Aristotle argues pretty forcefully that becoming good relies heavily on these external factors being raised well, being habituated through practice, living under just laws that compel us when reason alone doesn't work.
How does this ancient perspective really emphasizing the necessity of societal structure and external habituation for developing individual moral character? How does that stack up against maybe more modern ideas? Ideas that often champion things like self-reliance, individual freedom, personal choice as the main ways we become good people.
Yeah, that's a great question. And maybe thinking about it in Aristotelian terms, what kinds of laws or institutions, based on his reasoning, would he argue are most crucial today to help you and your community cultivate that excellence and truly flourish?
Something to chew on, definitely.
Yeah.
What does habituation look like in the 21st century?